Socrates was one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. He's also one of the first persons of humble origins to burn his way onto the pages of history, and yet he wrote nothing. He is credited with inventing the Socratic method, a form of inquiry based on question and answer intended to stimulate critical thinking. We know of him mainly from the writings of Plato, his greatest pupil, who makes him the principal interlocutor in his writings, including the Republic, the Symposium, and the Phaedo. He's also a character in The Clouds, a play by the comic dramatist Aristophanes, and in the writings of the essayist, historian, and mercenary officer Xenophon. Like Plato, Xenophon wrote an account of Socrates' trial. He also wrote a memoir of conversations with Socrates. But if it weren't for Plato, Socrates would be nothing more than a footnote to philosophy. Socrates spent his entire life in Athens. He only left the city when he was called upon to do military service, notably during the Peloponnesian War. He used to hang out in the Athenian Agora, the heart of the bustling city, where civic, religious, political, and commercial interests intersected. That's where he did much of his philosophizing, standing in the open or sheltering from the elements in one of the stoas or colonnaded buildings. He could be found almost every day, surrounded by a group of fellow citizens, arguing about virtue, about justice, about the ideal state, about the gods, and, as often as not, criticizing Athenian democracy. Below average height, fat, snub-nosed, with a disproportionately large head, he was instantly recognizable, more recognizable perhaps than any other Athenian. In fact, we're told that when Aristophanes' play The Clouds was performed, with him as a character, there were some foreigners present who didn't know who Socrates was. He wasn't afraid of being a celebrity. In fact, he seems to have liked it, because he was in the audience, and he stood up so that the foreigners would know who he was. Socrates didn't think of himself as a conventional philosopher. He certainly didn't attempt to map out a philosophical system. A number of the dialogues that Plato wrote with him as an interlocutor end in a kind of stalemate. He believed that an important goal of philosophy was to disabuse people of falsehood. He was unlike any other philosopher of the time in that he was interested exclusively in human beings, in how they behave and why. He wasn't in the least interested in natural philosophy, as we call it, in how the universe was composed and so forth.
I am like a midwife. I cannot give birth to wisdom because there is no wisdom in me. The many admirable truths that my pupils bring to birth have been discovered by themselves from within. But the delivery is the work of the gods and of me.
He had his fans, and he certainly had his detractors. Not everyone approved of his criticisms of democracy. He was noted for his sarcasm, his Socratic irony, as we call it. It didn't do to get into an argument with him. As likely as not, he'd try to make a fool of you by pretending to take your half-baked opinion seriously, and then, when your guard was down, proving that it was half-baked. By the time we encounter him at the very end of his life, he's been making himself utterly obnoxious to his fellow countrymen for over 50 years. And, to make matters worse, there was the company he kept. He particularly liked to be among right-wing aristocrats, men who sneered at ordinary Athenians and thought they were unfitted to run the state. Men like Alcibiades and Critias, who did so much damage to Athens and made deals with the enemy. The hated Spartans especially. But he also gave utterance to sentiments that are, to this day, the embodiment of true wisdom.
Neither cities nor the human race will have any respite from evil unless philosophers become kings, or those who rule as kings study philosophy. Virtue is knowledge. No one errs or does wrong willingly or knowingly. As for myself, all I know is that I know nothing. Wonder is the feeling of a philosopher, and philosophy begins in wonder. No one knows with regard to death whether it is not the greatest blessing that can happen to a man. Words that are false are not only evil in themselves, but infect the soul with evil. The God is not the cause of all things, only of the good. The greatest punishment that can happen is to be ruled by someone worse than oneself. It is the fear of this that makes men of good character rule when they do. My advice to you is to get married. If you find a good wife, you'll be happy. If you don't, you'll be a philosopher.
The year is 399 BCE. Athens has been through a lot. In 404, the Spartans and their allies finally brought the city to its knees, thereby ending the Peloponnesian War. The war that was fought between the Athenians and their allies versus the Spartans and their allies, who lived in southern Greece in the region we call the Peloponnese. As a result of her defeat, Athens had been deprived of her maritime empire, and a repressive oligarchical government called the 30 Tyrants had suspended the democracy and taken control. The leader of the 30 was Critias, Socrates' close friend and patron. 8 months later, the demos, the citizenry of Athens, aided by foreigners living in Athens, rose up against the 30, defeated them in battle, and restored the democracy. The new government, the restored democracy, acted with exemplary restraint. Only the 30 and their immediate henchmen were punished. All their other supporters were pardoned. Even so, someone had to carry the can, someone who was highly visible and known to have been thick with the opponents of democracy. So, in 399, a man called Meletus, along with a couple of his cronies, brought charges against Socrates.
Meletus, son of Meletus of the deme of Pythos, has brought this charge and lodged this affidavit against Socrates, son of Sophroniscus of the deme of Allopeke. Socrates has broken the law by not acknowledging the gods whom the state acknowledges and introducing new daimonic beings. He has also broken the law by perverting or subverting the young. The penalty should be death.
Not acknowledging the gods whom the state acknowledges meant not turning up at the great state festivals held in honor of Athena and Zeus and so on. The greatest of these was the Panathenaea, or All-Athenian Festival, which was celebrated on Athena's birthday in midsummer, and which we see being enacted on the great frieze that runs around the Parthenon, the temple of Athena Parthenos, the Virgin, which stands on the Acropolis. Introducing new daimonic beings meant worshipping your own personal divinities. Daimonic beings, our word demon derives from the Greek, were regarded with deep suspicion. The Athenians did not tolerate people who worshipped their own personal deities. A god had to be approved of by the state for you to worship her or him. No one had the right to an exclusive personal deity. Subverting or perverting the young could mean just about anything. What the prosecution meant clearly was teaching the youth to be critical of the democracy. You couldn't get away with a charge like that in a modern court because it was extremely vague and could cover a multitude of offences, making it impossible for the accused to refute the charge. In fact, that was one of the problems about all three charges lodged against Socrates. It isn't entirely clear what any of them meant. He now had to attend a pre-trial hearing, what we would call an arraignment. As the charges laid against Socrates had a religious component to them, they came under the general heading of asabaia, meaning impiety. This meant that Meletus had to file his suit before the Archon Basileus, the king archon or magistrate, in the Stoa Basileios, the king's stoa, a colonnaded building on the east side of the agora.
Do you plead guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Meletus's accusation was then displayed on a notice board in the agora, a short distance from the stoa. There's a tradition that a professional Athenian speechwriter called Lysias wrote a defense for Socrates, and that when he handed it to Socrates, Socrates looked at it and said,
It's a great speech, Lysias, but it won't serve me because it's the speech of a lawyer, not a philosopher.
and when Lysias inquired, "Why won't it serve you if it's a good speech?"
It'll no more serve me than nice clothes or beautiful shoes would.
So the day of the trial arrives, and both the plaintiff and defendant have a limited amount of time to present their case, probably well under 2 hours. The trial takes place in the law court known as the Heliaia in the Agora. Both plaintiff and defendant deliver a single speech. There are no lawyers, no public prosecutor, no witnesses, no cross-examination, no judge in our sense of the word. Written depositions from witnesses are, however, read out. In addition, it's permissible for the defendant to cross-examine the plaintiff. Socrates does so to humiliate Meletus by pointing out that the charge of corrupting the youth brought against him doesn't make sense. What else is odd about an Athenian trial? 2 things. Firstly, there's a very large jury, either 500 or 501, we don't know for sure. Secondly, they're all men, because only men were citizens of Athens. Any man over the age of 30 could serve, but in practice there was a preponderance of old men among the jurors, both because they had the leisure time to serve as jurors, and because the payment for their services was a kind of pension. An Athenian trial will always be wrapped up in the space of a single day, or even half a day. To make sure that both the plaintiff and the defendant speak for exactly the same amount of time, the clerk of the court, a slave, removes a bung from a water clock known as a clepsydra. Clepsydra means literally water thief. A clepsydra is the most accurate as well as the simplest timing device ever invented. It's low-tech, but it's absolutely brilliant. All it consists of is one vase placed above another. The upper vase has a small hole just below the rim so that it can be filled up with water to the last drop to that exact level. At the base is a hole which can be stopped up with a bung. When the bung is removed, the water from the upper vase starts trickling into the lower vase at a steady rate. If the speaker pauses, for instance, in order to have a deposition read out to the court, he'll ask the clerk to replace the bung while he reads the deposition. Another feature of the clepsydra is that the speaker can tell when his time was running out because, as the water drains, the direction of the flow from the upper vase alters. In this way, both speeches were timed down to the last second. The plaintiff always spoke first. Meletus's speech hasn't survived. However, we do have a version, or rather 2 versions of the speech that Socrates delivered in his defense, one written by Xenophon and the other by Plato. Scholars generally regard Plato's version as more authentic, but even so, it was hardly a verbatim account. Obviously, there were no transcripts kept of the court proceedings, added to which Socrates spoke extemporaneously. So both Plato and Xenophon must have had to invent quite a bit. We call the speech that Socrates delivered the Apology, from the Greek word apologia. The Greek word apologia does not mean the same as the English word apology, however. Anything but, in fact. Socrates wasn't about to apologize to anyone. Apologia merely means the speech that comes after, or the speech in response, because the plaintiff had spoken first.
I'm actually facing two sets of accusers. Meletus and the others who have brought these present charges against me, and another set. The earlier set are those who claim that, I quote, "I am committing an injustice by looking into things below the earth and up in the sky, making the weaker argument appear the stronger, and teaching others to follow my example." Making the weaker argument appear the stronger, is that what you think I do? That's actually what the sophists do. The ones who teach rhetoric and question conventional values. I'm not in their set. Both because they deny that there's any such thing as absolute right and wrong, and because they charge for their services. I believe that wisdom, which is what I teach, should be dispensed free of charge. I have gained a reputation for human wisdom. When my friend Chirophone went to Delphi to ask if there was anyone wiser than myself, the priestess answered, "No one." It seems to me that the god was not actually referring literally to Socrates, but was taking me as an example, as if to say, the wisest is he who has realized, like Socrates, that in regard to wisdom, he is worthless. The god has appointed me to this city as to a thoroughbred horse, which, because of its size, is lazy and needs to be stirred up by a stinging fly. It is for me to perform the office of such a fly, to rouse and persuade and reprove every one of you. I am visited by a divine voice which comes to me to dissuade me from what I propose to do. This is what debars me from public life.
Imagine the impact which this had on the jury. If they had been expecting Socrates to eat humble pie, they were sorely disappointed. No doubt they interrupted from time to time, shouting, stamping their feet, heckling him, throwing nuts at him perhaps. When Socrates finished speaking, the jury doesn't retire to deliberate. It votes straight away. This was customary practice in every Athenian trial. Each juror takes his place in line while he waits to cast his vote, which he does by casting his ballot. I mean literally casting it. This was done in such a way that you couldn't tell how each juror was voting. The jurors, all 500 or 501 of them, file one by one through a narrow passage. There is a box on either side into which each juror casts two wheel-shaped ballots, one pierced and the other solid. It's a secret ballot, so he can't tell how the man in line before him has voted. But which ballot he casts into the left and which into the right depends on whether he is acquitting or condemning the accused. The whole process must have taken the better part of an hour, given the size of the jury, because of course the court clerks had to make sure that no one voted twice, and then afterwards the votes had to be counted. In the interim, the jurors return to their benches and eagerly await the verdict. All that is needed is a simple majority. Eventually, a hush falls upon the jurors as the judge prepares to announce the verdict. It was all very theatrical, no doubt. And then they hear that 220 jurors have voted to acquit the defendant and 280 have found him guilty as charged, a majority of 60. Note, they didn't vote on each charge as a modern jury would do. They vote on all the charges together. The trial isn't over yet, however. Far from it. Because now the plaintiff and the defendant are each invited to recommend a punishment. Obviously, the plaintiff will recommend a harsh punishment and the defendant a more lenient punishment. Meletus rises first.
I recommend that Socrates' punishment be execution.
I recommend that my punishment be free meals for the rest of my life at public expense in the Prytaneum, the town hall.
Socrates, in other words, has deliberately gone out of his way to antagonize the jury yet further by claiming that he deserves the same reward, not punishment, but reward, as an Olympic victor, a victor in the Olympic Games that was celebrated every 4 years. In other words, he's making a mockery of the judicial system. Eventually, however, his friends at court, Plato included, persuade him to offer a reasonable alternative, a fine.
Okay, I'll pay 1 minar, but 1 minar only, not a drachma more.
The damage has been done, however. He's antagonized even more people, and the jurors vote again. 60 more jurors than had previously voted for his acquittal now vote for his execution. On learning the verdict, Socrates, according to Plato, delivers one last speech in which he speculates, very philosophically I might add, on death and the afterlife.
Let me tell you a thing or two, my fellow citizens. You have not gained much time in executing me. I'm an old man and I would have died anyway soon. Instead, you will have gained the reputation of having executed a wise man. For that is the verdict that posterity will pass on you, whether I am wise or not. I know that one of the reasons you have condemned me is that I did not make an appeal to pity, as most defendants do, to get you on my side. As for my accusers, I have nothing but contempt for them. They have been condemned by the truth for being vile and unjust men. As for you, instead of escaping criticism by killing me, as you hoped, you will be the object of criticism for having put me to death. Death? You think I'm afraid to die? Not at all. Either death is non-existence, and the dead are conscious of nothing, or it's a migration of the soul from one place to the other. And if it's a migration, what's there to fear? We'll find ourselves in the presence of men like Homer and Hesiod. And what wouldn't you give to meet them? Death holds no fear for the good man. And in actual fact, I hold no grudge against those who voted for my condemnation, because now I will be done with all my troubles. But now it is time for us to part. You to life, me to death. But which of us goes to the better destiny is unknown to everybody except the god.
Usually, a sentence of execution was carried out immediately. On this occasion, however, the condemned man stayed in prison for about a month. That is because his trial happened to take place on the day that a sacred ship sailed from Athens to the island of Delos to commemorate the killing of the Minotaur, a creature half human, half bull, by Theseus, an early king of Athens. There was a fear that if the Athenians were to execute Socrates on the day the ship sailed, the ship would become polluted and bear its pollution to Delos, the sacred island where Apollo and Artemis were born. So Socrates is taken away to the state prison, which is where he will remain till the day of his execution. In his dialogue, the Phaedo, Plato tells us that on the night before his execution, Socrates conversed amiably with his friends, the topic being the immortality of the soul, which Socrates sought to prove.
I have a firm hope that there is something in store for those who have died, and something much better for the good than for the wicked. Is not what we call death a freeing and separation of the body from the soul? The soul is in the very likeness of the divine and immortal and intelligible and indissoluble and unchangeable, while the body is in the very likeness of the human and mortal and unintelligible and multiform and dissoluble and changeable. Of course, no reasonable man would claim that everything is exactly as I've described them, but that something very like this is true for our soul's future habitations, for we have clear evidence that the soul is immortal. This is a belief worth risking, but the risk is a noble one.
Have you any instructions as to how we should live, Socrates?
If you look after yourselves, you will please me.
We will do our best. But how should we bury you?
Any way you like, as long as you can catch me and I don't slip through your fingers. Crito, someone had better fetch the poison, if it's ready. Otherwise, tell the man to prepare it.
But the sun is still up. We have plenty of time. We have till nightfall.
I would only make myself ridiculous if I clung to life at the moment that it is ebbing from me. Do as I say, please, and don't make difficulties.
Call the poisoner.
I must prepare myself for death.
Here you are, Socrates. Just drink it, and then walk about until your legs feel heavy, and then lie down. It'll take its natural course.
Am I permitted to pour a libation to the gods?
We only prepare what is just enough.
Now stop the crying. I wish to die in a tranquil frame of mind. We owe a cock to Asclepius, Crito. See that it be paid.
This was the end of Socrates, a man who was the best and the wisest and the most just of any we have known. So concluded Plato. Socrates' execution is often seen, with some justification, as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, stain on Athenian democracy. Perhaps some members of the jury, when they went home that night after the trial, regretted their hasty decision to convict him and their even more hasty decision to execute him. In the last of the 3 speeches that he gave at his trial, Socrates warned the Athenians that posterity would condemn them for executing him, not least because he was an old man and they wouldn't have had to wait long for him to die. And of course, he was right.